Welcome to the Great Loop Radio podcast, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA. Today we're going to talk about vessel safety checks and why they're important and why every boater should get one. Our guest will be Robert Rice. You've seen him before if you are a regular listener or viewer of this podcast, and he is going to walk us through what we need to know. Before we jump in, as always, I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Curtis Stokes and Associates, Great Loop Yacht Sales, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. And with that finished, I would like to officially welcome Robert Rice back. Robert, thank you for joining us once again.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, for anyone who maybe hasn't caught you on our podcast before, just fill us in a little bit about yourself. We can see you in your Coast Guard Auxiliary uniform and your boating experience.
So I'm a member of the U.S. Coast Guard's unpaid volunteer component. This is a uniquely Coast Guard organization. I'm a member of the Coast Guard, but in a different way than the active duty and reserve component military members. So I'm an unpaid volunteer. There are a lot of us in the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and the Auxiliary is focused on two things. One is recreational boater safety education and outreach. The basic idea is if we can help recreational boaters be safe, the search and rescue teams can do other things rather than coming to save you from a preventable problem. The other thing the Coast Guard Auxiliary does is an astonishing array of Coast Guard support. Pretty much anything and everything short of direct military action and direct law enforcement. There are probably people in Coast Guard Auxiliary who do that. You qualify in the same ways that active duty members do, and then provide direct support to the Coast Guard. It's a fantastic organization. My boating background is, well, I'm a boating safety instructor for the Coast Guard Auxiliary and also for Texas Parks and Wildlife, which is our state boating regulatory agency here in my home state of Texas. I teach sailing through an extremely active Girl Scout sailing program and help qualify new instructors, work on qualifying new instructors for that program. And this is all my daughter's fault. She got me involved in that sailing program when she was 12 or so, and I kind of got sucked into it. I'd never really boated much before that, a little bit of lake boating with my dad when I was young for fishing, but I really got the sailing bug through my daughter. And then a couple of years ago, my wife and I started talking about things we might do, and I floated the idea of the Great Loop. I don't know how I came across it, and she jumped on the idea of something she was willing to do, and from there it ended up now we own a boat.
Well, and we're happy to have you as a member, and we thank you for your service to the Coast Guard. And hopefully everyone listening, will take this to heart, that the educational opportunities through the Coast Guard Auxiliary are substantial. So for those of you who are new to boating or just want to brush up on some of the rules of the road and how to stay safe out there, look for your local Coast Guard Auxiliary because they do a fabulous job on the education component. So today we're going to talk about vessel safety checks.
Right.
There probably are a lot of people out there who aren't even familiar with the term. So let's start at the very beginning. What is a vessel safety check?
So a vessel safety check is a voluntary sort of no-fault consultation with a qualified vessel examiner. I'm one of those. It's a thing we often do in the Coast Guard Auxiliary. The other organization for boaters, U.S. Power Squadron, also branded America's Boating Club, they also have vessel safety examiner who use the same qualification process and work from the same checklist. So you can get your vessel safety check from either organization. But it's really, I would say more than anything, it's a safety consultation. It's a conversation with the vessel safety examiner as we work through a checklist of the minimum required safety equipment. Basically, when we do this, we're working from the exact same checklist that the active duty Coast Guard boarding team members will use if they stop you to conduct a boarding. So the idea is we want you to be a better, more prepared, safer boater. and to set you up for success if you're boarded by the Coast Guard.
Yeah. And I know some of our listeners are probably thinking, what is the list of the required safety equipment? We're going to post a link to a chart in the description on the video and the audio version of this. And that's because the requirements differ by size of boat. And one of the breaks in the requirements is right at 40 feet.
Yeah, there's a little bit of variation by boat size, but for looper-sized boats, sort of 26 feet and above, the requirements are all fairly similar. There are two categories, 26 to 40 and then 40 to 65. The differences are slight between those two. If you have an extremely large, at least in my mind, extremely large looper boat over 65 feet, unfortunately, Coast Guard regulations are we can't do a vessel safety exam. There is a way to get a vessel safety exam, but it has to be done by somebody who's qualified as a commercial vessel examiner, which is not my area. There's a process for doing that. It's just in the ordinary situation, the vessel has to be under 65 feet or below to get the kind of free, no fault vessel safety exam we're talking about. The other thing that's important about what we do for these vessel safety checks is if your boat doesn't pass, there's not a fine or a ticket or anything. And really, I would say that it's not a matter of failing the vessel safety exam. It's just we haven't finished it yet. So if there's something missing or something you need to correct, then we have a conversation about what needs to be adjusted. And then I come back next week and finish it up and complete it at that point. That's usually the way that works.
Yeah. So anything else we should know about, why should someone take the time to get a vessel safety check, VSC?
Right. So Coast Guard has a pretty good idea of why people get into trouble on the water. And a lack of boater education is high on that list of factors that lead people into danger. The other is just not being prepared. And the minimum safety requirements are pretty minimal, but they are very important. So the goal here is to help you be safer on the water and to be ready if something bad happens. But also the other way I think of it is the vessel safety check is sort of ticket prevention. Loopers are on the water a lot more than your average boater. And so the odds of you being boarded by the U.S. Coast Guard or by state or local law enforcement are a little higher just because you're out and about so much while you're doing loop. And so the goal is we want you to be ready. I got boarded bringing my boat home after I bought her. I got boarded by U.S. Coast Guard small boat team as we were coming through New Orleans. And they did the inspection. And at the end, they said, wow, you were really prepared. That's the point. I said, oh, yeah, there's a reason for that. I do this. We laughed about it for a minute, but
yeah, absolutely. And you're right that those minimum requirements are minimal.
They are.
We have our
surprisingly minimal.
Yeah, when we have our rendezvous, we, thanks to generally one of the local Coast Guard auxiliary units,
right,
we offer vessel safety checks to the boats that are in the harbor. We don't offer them; the Coast Guard auxiliary does, but we help set that up and facilitate that. And a couple of the comments after the last one was like, "Wow, that was a really minimal look at the equipment," and we kind of said, yeah, that's the minimal requirements. But as you said, you can get ticketed if you don't have those requirements. Right. And I would hope that most loopers do. But personal experience, we had one very recently. There were about 4 or 5 looper boats at the same marina for a good bit of time over the winter in Punta Gorda. Mm-hmm. So one boater called the local auxiliary and they sent an examiner out to do all of us at the same time. And we had a fire extinguisher out of date. So even when you have all of the safety equipment and more things like that, can cause you to not pass the vessel safety check. And then therefore, if that had instead been a boarding, we could have been ticketed for that. And of course we want a working fire extinguisher aboard. Right. So we were very thankful that they pointed out that was expired. So all in all, a really good experience and helpful because we didn't realize what we had that was out of spec, so to speak.
The required list is so minimal. Mm-hmm. What I find when I do a vessel safety check, particularly on a looper-sized boat, whether they're loopers or not, is I end up having a lot more conversation with the boat owners about other safety issues. Mm-hmm. And so I really think about the vessel safety check as much more than just working through the checklist, and much more as a consultation, a conversation about, okay, how do we make sure we're all safe?
Mm-hmm.
Water.
Yeah. And so because you do it kind of as a consultation or a conversation, it's pretty different than an actual official law enforcement boarding.
Well, it's the exact same checklist.
Mm-hmm.
It is. So we work from because I've looked. When I got boarded in New Orleans, when you complete that, they leave you a copy of the boarding report, and I've compared that report to the checklist that I work from, and it's got the same checklist items, and it should. That's the point, is
Mm-hmm.
that the vessel safety check works from the same checklist of required safety equipment that an active duty boarding team will work from if they stop you. And because the goal is we want you to be ready for that law enforcement boarding if it ever happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there's no cost for this, correct?
Right, absolutely. So what the Coast Guard Auxiliary does is free, no charge. Same with our friends at Power Squadron. The vessel safety check is a free service to recreational boaters. So no charge. If you don't pass, you just haven't passed yet. You haven't failed. And we don't rat you out to the active duty folks or make some sort of law enforcement report if your vessel doesn't pass.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're actually boarded by the Coast Guard or local law enforcement and you don't pass that inspection, there is definitely the possibility of a ticket, a
Mm-hmm.
fine or a ticket. I would say the Coast Guard's approach tends to be more carrot and less stick. And I think you're likely to find that a Coast Guard boarding team, if you're short on meeting the requirements, there's likely to be a conversation, and less likely to be a fine, depending on sort of what it is. People tend to get exercised, people in law enforcement in general tend to get exercised about people being cavalier about safety for kids. So if your boat is crawling with little kids and you have no kid-sized life jackets, you're likely to find people pretty unhappy with you. But in the ordinary course of things, if you got one expired fire extinguisher, I would say the odds are good that you'll get a conversation about that and a warning, but not a ticket.
Yeah.
Would be my expect, at least from the Coast Guard. I've heard reports from folks who've had contact with state law enforcement that were not so friendly. There is sort of at the core or foundation of the U.S. Coast Guard the idea of being humble public servants. And that goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton. Our man Al is actually the founder of the U.S., what became the U.S. Coast Guard. And there's a letter he wrote to the first officers of what was then called the Revenue Cutter Service about being humble public servants. And to do your job with respect for your fellow citizens. That's fabulous stuff.
And I think
and
that
it really
that
lies
culture,
at the heart of the Coast Guard culture. Yeah,
it absolutely does. That culture, I think, shows through. I have never heard of an unprofessional Coast Guard crew boarding a looper boat.
Yeah. So I had a really interesting experience about 3 months ago. One of the things that we in the auxiliary do is this support for Coast Guard. And so I recently qualified for boat crew through the Coast Guard Auxiliary. We work from the same qualification program that the active duty folks. Our qualification's about 98% the same as what Coast Guard small boat folks do. And they asked us to bring a large recreational boat, not my boat, but a friend's, but a looper-sized cruising boat, to a Coast Guard station so we could provide the platform for boarding team members to get qualified for doing recreational boarding. So there was a qualification examiner came from the district headquarters, and some very junior Coast Guard members could put through their paces. Really interesting to see, but it was also reinforced to me that what we do in the auxiliary in our vessel safety check really does prepare people to have that interaction with Coast Guard folks.
Yeah, excellent. So if we are have scheduled a vessel safety check, how long should we allot what
So we
are
come
the
to you,
expectations?
right,
Mm-hmm.
wherever your boat is. So it's a matter of finding somebody within a reasonable distance. And when you request one, you plug in the address of where the boat is, and somebody will come to you. Once we get there for a looper sized boat, my experience is 45 minutes, maybe an hour,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a little less, but that's the right ballpark. So I call it 45 minutes. It depends on how talkative you are, how talkative I am that day, how much conversation we need to have to sort of sort through safety issues. If folks have a lot of questions or are starting at a very basic level of knowledge, the conversation is probably going to be longer.
Mm-hmm.
And at least for me, when I'm talking to a looper, the conversation does go longer because we talk about things in greater detail. And of course, we got to talk about doing the loop. So,
of course.
yeah, right. It just ends up being a longer conversation. But,
right.
For a looper size boat, probably 45 minutes or so is the right idea.
Okay, that's a good stage setter for what to expect. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about some of the most common reasons that boats may not pass on the first attempt for a vessel safety check. So We'll be back in a moment.
How unique is the new Portofino restaurant and events in Utica? Let's start with Utica's only waterfront dining. Inside has been beautifully remodeled into a 2-level dining experience. Choose upstairs for an open, airy, and inviting atmosphere with a beautiful view of the waterfront. For a quiet, intimate dinner, the downstairs ambience makes it the perfect dining spot. Both levels with the same great food, an exquisite menu prepared by our own executive chef. Reserve your dinner experience at portofinoutica.com.
Winter Harbor Marina is located on the Oneida River 1.5 miles west of Oneida Lake in Brewerton, New York, just minutes from Syracuse International Airport. Winter Harbor offers the lowest diesel fuel and gas prices from New York City to Canada. If you find a lower posted documented price, they will match it. Their amenities include complimentary courtesy vehicle, 24-hour pay-at-the-pump fueling, dockside water and cable TV, pristine bathrooms and showers, and emergency haul-out service. For more information, call 315-676-9276 or visit www.winterharborllc.com. Winter Harbor is a proud commander sponsor of AGLCA.
We're back on the Great Loop Radio podcast. My guest today is Robert Rice. He is with the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, and we are talking about vessel safety checks. So, Rob, tell us, in your experiences, what are some of the most common reasons that a boat might not pass a vessel safety check?
Number one is expired flares.
Mm-hmm.
Do that all the time. And flares, I kind of hate flares. They're kind of a problem because they do expire, and then there's no easy way to dispose of them. You can keep expired flares on your boat as long as you can lay hands on a set of unexpired current ones when you're boarded. So you can keep expired ones on the boat as spares. In the auxiliary, we sometimes use expired flares for our own training, and mostly they work, depending on how old. If they get really, really old, they may not. But expired flares, that's the number one thing. The second thing would be expired, missing, or not enough fire extinguishers. That's probably the second one. Not having the boat's original documentation on hand. So the requirement, this is not exactly a safety thing, a regulatory thing. Most states, for a state registered boat, issue you a card that is sort of the certificate of registration for the boat. You have to have that original card with you. And if your boat is U.S. Coast Guard documented, you have to have the original certificate of documentation on hand. Not having those, that's fairly common. And then there are three kinds of stickers or placards that you're required to have if you have a looper-sized boat. So this is not an issue for most recreational boaters with, smaller boats. But if you're 26 feet and over, you're required to have a pollution sticker. This is an international treaty thing. 40 feet and over, you have to have a MARPOL, which is a marine pollution international treaty. You have to have a MARPOL trash placard. And 40 feet and over for a boat that's ocean going. And I think the Coast Guard's going to look at a looper boat as being ocean going. You have to have a written trash management plan. all three of those stickers, you can walk into a West Marine store and buy a 3-pack that's got all 3 stickers for $20. I forget what it is. There's no specific requirement about exactly where you have to place them. I have them on the back of a cabinet door in the galley. And that was one of the first things the boarding team members asked me when I was boarded. Let's see your placards, and open the galley door and say, here they are. And they go, yep, got them all. You're good to go. That's pretty common. For vessels 39.4 feet and above, you have to have a copy of the navigation rules, the collision regs. You can do that electronically. That is permissible as long as that copy of the rules is electronically downloaded and stored locally, accessible without an internet connection. I think you're better off to have a paperback book copy, just in terms of ease of picking up the book, looking up the rules. It's just a lot easier than pulling out your phone and trying to flip through on a small screen to read the rules. I think you're better off, but electronic copy is legit. The other one that I see with some frequency is folks who have inflatable life jackets, and there's no CO2 cartridge in the life jacket. That happens a fair bit. If you have an automatic inflator style life jacket, that inflator mechanism expires and has to be replaced every once in a while. Most manufacturers, it's either a 4-year or 5-year cycle, I think. But there'll be an expiration date printed on the inflator. Typically, you can see that through a clear plastic window at the sort of bottom edge of the life jacket. So an expired inflator will get you, or no CO. And it happens. I pick up somebody's inflatable life jacket, feel around. There's no CO2 cartridge in this thing. One of the things that happens, I think, is some life jacket manufacturers, when you buy the thing at the store, the CO2 cartridge is not installed in the life jacket. It's sort of loose in the package, and people look at that as, oh, I got a spare CO2 cartridge. No, it's the CO2 cartridge for your life jacket. So that one happens quite a bit. Typically, folks have enough life jackets if they've thought about this at all. That usually is not the problem. Those are the big ones. Those are the most common ones, and they're easy to fix. For flares, the expiration date is printed on the body of the flare itself. You just have to pick it up and look at it.
Okay.
And my advice buying flares in a store is look at the package before you buy the package of flares to make sure you're not buying a package of flares that's close to its expiration date. They are supposed to be good for, it's an odd number, 42 months or something like that from the date of manufacture. So you want to look at it and make sure you have a couple of years of unexpired life left before you buy the things.
Yeah, that's a good tip. I wouldn't have thought of that. So hopefully we've inspired some to get their vessel safety check. If we have, how do they go about scheduling one?
Okay, so really easy. My recommendation is go to the Coast Guard Auxiliary's website, CGAUX, or short for Coast Guard Auxiliary, cgaux.org. On the left-hand side, on the top is a thing that says, get a vessel safety exam. I think is actually what it says. Click on that and it takes you to a page where you can plug in your address and hit a button that says, yes, I would like a vessel safety exam. That will automatically email the local vessel safety examiners who will reach out to you and help you get one set up.
Excellent.
So easy.
Yeah, very easy. This next question might not be quite as easy. I have a couple of questions about Canada. First of all, we have a lot of loopers from Canada.
Sure.
How does this work for them?
So the Canadians, our Canadian friends, have a very similar system for vessel safety exams through their equivalent organization. So there is a Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary. It's a little different than what I do, but it's very, very much the same idea. So Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary can do it. There is a Canadian Power Squadron. They can do it. And there's a third organization called Canadian Lifeboat Institution, which is sort of like the Coast Guard Auxiliary, but different, I think. Those 3 organizations can do the vessel safety exam. Canadian requirements on minimum boat safety equipment are different. I'm remembering something about an axe and a bucket being on their list, although I don't remember precisely.
I do remember something about that as well. And that kind of leads to the second part of my question on that. for U.S. flagged boats traveling into Canada or Canadian boats traveling into the U.S., do they need to carry different safety equipment, or is what the U.S. flag boat has for the U.S. recognized for Canada?
Great question. It's very clear for U.S. boats traveling temporarily in Canada, because there's a clear and definite rule that if you're in Canada for a short period of time, and I've forgotten at the moment, but I want to say 60 days or something like that, then as long as you comply with your home U.S. requirements, you're good for Canada. The reverse for Canadian vessels traveling in the U.S. is not quite as clear. The U.S. regulation is phrased, if I remember correctly, in terms of a vessel being temporarily in the United States. My concern would be that, 30 days or 60 days is temporarily. 9 months, I don't know that that's temporarily. That's the thing I worry about just a bit. And I have never been able to find greater clarity. It's just a function of our U.S. regulation being phrased differently. The Canadian regulation is very definite. There's a specific time frame.
Yeah.
Which I think is 60 or 90 days. I've forgotten.
I think you're right about this. I can't remember the time frame either. 60 or 90 days. I know it's enough that most loopers going into Canada don't have to worry about that axe and bucket thing. And that's why I've heard of that. And that's where it comes up, as I've had people go, do I really need to get this axe and bucket? And for most loopers, the amount of time in Canada, that would not apply. If any of our Canadian members have questions about the U.S. equipment, and if I'm remembering correctly, most of what you need in Canada will cover you for the U.S. So, it's not a big expense to get the additional things if there is any. But if any of our Canadian members have questions, reach out to me, krusso@greatloop.org. I'm happy to look into that with some more specific details.
Yeah. So one of the things that has changed in the last couple of years to make this a little easier is U.S. and Canada now have essentially the same life jacket certification rules. They used to be different. The Coast Guard changed its certification rules a couple of years ago to harmonize them with Canada and to make them a little more harmonized with Europe, to sort of globalize the market for life jackets a little bit. And that sort of simplifies, because there were questions about, what about U.S. life jackets in Canada? Because Canada had very specific, very narrow approvals for life jackets. And that created a problem in Canada because there were comparatively few choices for legit Canadian life jackets. And so the U.S. change has made things a little easier for our Canadian friends.
Yeah, we like when they harmonize those rules back and forth, because we share so much of a water border with Canada, and we've got so many loopers going back and forth. Harmonization of those rules is lovely for us.
Yeah. The other thing that is easy between U.S. and Canada is there is a sort of international agreement between U.S. and Canada that if you have a boater safety class in the U.S., Canada should recognize, they're supposed to recognize that, and vice versa. So there is, just like you can have, most states require some people to have a boater safety education course. Canada has similar requirements. Those two classes should translate so that you're okay either way. If you're a U.S. boater briefly in Canada, or you're a Canadian boater visiting the U.S., your boater safety education card or certificate should be good for meeting that requirement.
Yeah, and every looper should have one of those. There
Absolutely.
are a few states, and increasing on the loop, that require it for transient boaters. Alabama just this year passed a law that transient boaters do need that a safety class, as do Alabama citizens, but they've added the transient boaters to that. So keep that in mind as well. Final question for you, Rob. This may be one of those, kind of boating myths or folklore. When you pass your vessel safety check, you get a sticker that goes on the boat. Does that mean you're not going to get boarded by the Coast Guard?
No. I'll tell you the practical reason is that sticker goes on the port side of the boat someplace, and if a U.S. Coast Guard small boat team is approaching you from the stern, they've made the decision to board you long before anybody is going to have a chance to see that sticker. Yeah. The correct response, what boarding team members are trained to do is they're supposed to understand the nature of the voluntary vessel safety check we do, and they're supposed to react sort of great. Then you're set up for success. It's possible that if they approach you and you tell them, I've had a vessel safety exam, they might say, oh, we'll go check somebody else today. I think if they've made the decision to board you, they're probably going to board you. When we were boarded in New Orleans, I am convinced that the young woman who actually sort of took the lead was working on her boarding team qualification, just given her interaction with the chief petty officer that was sort of supervising. And they would probably choose somebody easy to help somebody qualify as opposed to somebody they were really concerned about. In that boarding, one thing that surprises people is U.S. law is very clear that the Coast Guard has authority to board any vessel in U.S. waters for a sort of safety and regulatory compliance inspection. And think of it this way. It's much the same as the idea that long-haul truckers have to pull over to those highway weigh stations and be inspected. Same kind of thing. It's not a search and seizure for criminal law purposes. It's, do you have the required safety equipment? Do you meet the minimum regulatory requirements? And Coast Guard boarding, that will be polite, professional. They'll be serious about their business. They're law enforcement officers, so they go armed, just like any law enforcement officer. But they will be polite, professional, and courteous. I would be astonished if they were less than polite, professional. Serious, but polite.
Yeah. Most of the loopers that I have spoken to that have been boarded report it as a nice experience. In fact,
absolutely.
To interface with our men and women who are protecting boats and boaters and making sure we all stay safe out there. So
absolutely.
So Robert Rice, thank you for joining us once again and sharing a lot of these details. Hopefully everyone will make sure they have the required safety equipment and more. Hopefully they'll get a vessel safety check. If not, if you're boarded, as we said, it's generally a pretty good experience, but having the vessel safety check, especially recently, is one of the things that I think is going to help you feel more confident if that boarding happens, because you know where everything is. You have recently looked for it. And actually, I just said that you had it recently. I don't know that we've mentioned how long the sticker is good for. How frequently should you do a vessel safety check?
For a year. So ideally you would get re-inspected once a year, just to touch base with somebody and have a new conversation about safety. And really, one of the things is forces you to do things like pull out that package of flares that you haven't thought about and check the expiration date, check the bottom of your fire extinguisher to see if it's expired, that sort of thing.
Exactly. So I know I said that previous one was the last question, but one more question for you. When are you and Robin thinking about heading out on the loop?
Well, we've got our youngest is still in college. We have two big dogs, two 90-pound German Shepherds. And so we're sort of navigating the question of, can we really take the dogs with us? Maybe we wait till the youngest graduates from college and we convince him to move home and look after the dogs for a year while we go. I think it's a year or two or three off. For now, we're going to do some local cruising and just enjoy the boat.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to seeing you on the loop, but we know you're doing some cruising until then, so enjoy that beautiful boat. And thank you for once again sharing all these details. We really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
And thanks to everyone who's watched or listened this week. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.